Welcome back to the Sports and Entertainment Spotlight Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Marie, and it's really great to have you guys tune in today with us. We're going to be learning about where the actual storytelling and production happens. And there's nobody better to help us out with that than producer and former head of post production and visual effects with International Originals, Amazon MGM Studios, Steve Bannerman. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time and being with us today. It's just such a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's cool to be here with you.
Yeah. You've had a really great background. You started out in technology and moved your way into post production. We're going to bounce to how you got started into your post production side. You've got some really great experience with Amazon, but you also have it with the local post and Similar Generate Arts. So tell us a little bit of why post production. What was the story behind why you just chose that genre to get into?
Sure. Well, I sort of fell in love with post production when I was working at. I was at Apple. I was the product manager for high end Power Macintosh computers, which were the computers of choice for making interactive and multimedia content. Remember when we called it multimedia way back
Yeah.
in the day? Nobody was even dreaming of using personal computers to create content that would get broadcast over the air at that point yet. We were just getting ready to start working on it. But obviously, I started to get to know the customers that I was selling the high end computers to, and then this thing came along called QuickTime, which I instantly looked at and said, "That's the future." Somebody came along and put a floppy disk in a computer and double clicked on a file, and a little 320 by 240 video at 5 frames a second played without having to have any kind of a laser disc player or anything connected to your computer. And I thought, okay, I can see where that's going. So I switched over from the hardware side of Apple to the software side and became the product manager for QuickTime. And I was a product manager for 4 or 5 versions of QuickTime through the history. And so as that technology began to emerge, people started using it for more and more things, as I envisioned. And, lo and behold, the combination of QuickTime and computers became the foundation of production and post production for everything that we see today, whether it's broadcast on air or whether it's sent directly to a streamer. So I've always been fascinated by post production. And as you quite rightly point out, as I began to build a career around post production, it became obvious to me that significant chunk, if not the majority, of storytelling actually happens in post, at least for feature level products. I mean, there's this entire world of this creator economy that's emerging from places like TikTok and YouTube. They do things very differently, potentially. They don't always do production, post production, distribute, kind of, they're more ad hoc. So I can't necessarily speak to that, but I will say that that world seems like it wants to merge with the traditional content creation world today. So I think post production as a thing has a really long life yet to come. And there's an awful lot to evolve and learn and implement in post production. So I love taking the technical stuff, marrying it with the creative stuff, keeping the left side of my brain working in conjunction with the right side of my brain. And post really offers the best opportunity to do that.
Yeah, that's very true. Do you feel like your experience with Apple and Johnny Ives has helped you with post production? You got the creative, you got the technical, and sometimes it's hard to marry those. And you've had a really great experience with working from the technical side. So, how do you feel like that helped prepare you for doing post production? And now
Well,
moving towards production, which is what you want to get into.
sure, sure. Well, I mean, that's an excellent question, right? And I think it really sort of boils down to your approach to things and your thought process. One of the things that I loved about getting a technical degree, and I went to school at Georgia Tech many moons ago, it's the way they teach you how to learn. It's a very structured way of looking at things and working through problems and solving problems, right? So you sort of start with that. But one of the things that I loved that I learned from Steve Jobs and working with him and working with Johnny Ive at Apple was, anytime Steve or Johnny saw an object, right, they knew how everybody else was looking at it. Like everybody else is looking at it from this side. What's over here, right? What's behind there? There's opportunity here where people aren't looking. And so let's explore that and let's double click on that before we get caught up in the way everybody else sees the world and the way everybody else sees the potential of certain projects and things like that. And so that thought process is really crucial to me in the way that I evaluate virtually everything that I see and everything that I do. If I could put a title on a business card, the title that I would choose is Chief Recognizer of Good Ideas. I don't always come up with them. I'm not the most brilliant guy on the planet, but I recognize a really good idea when I see one, like QuickTime, and I jump on that and I say, this has got legs. This is going forward. The world is going to move in this direction. How can I gain a first mover advantage here? How can I lead instead of waiting for this to happen and then sort of following it after a big chunk of the opportunity has already been given to somebody?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then QuickTime Player, I mean, I think we all take that for granted because like we were talking about a little bit earlier, it's like magic, all the technology that we've got today compared to the dial up. And I was talking to somebody the other day where they had the paper, what was it? You had punch computers basically, right? Because they all
Punch
had
card.
the
Yeah.
yeah, the
Punch card.
punch cards.
Yeah.
Um,
That's right.
yeah, that was, like and now, wow, I mean, it's completely changed and different. So the QuickTime Player is something we take for, granted, and that was
Yeah.
a huge ordeal back then.
Oh yeah. I mean, when I was in college, I programmed using punch cards, and you not only had your program in that deck of cards, but you also had your data. So the card deck was really big, and I
Yeah.
felt sorry for those people that dropped their card deck, and they're all of a sudden it wasn't in order anymore, but now now we've got computers in our microwaves and our refrigerators. I mean, it's like that's such distant past. I love the pace of change, in technology, and I love the way technology gets applied to every corner of our lives. And just making content and storytelling is only one example of that. But can you imagine a world without iPhones and a world without YouTube now and a world without connected appliances in your kitchen and a TV that's got Netflix built into it and Amazon Prime built into it? And I love the world that we have now, and I love the technology that has evolved, and I love playing a part in it.
Yeah, and speaking of evolving, iPhones, you just brought that up. What are we moving towards in the industry here? So, we're going to a lot of short form videos and a lot of YouTube. What does that look like for our industry? The iPhone, how do you feel like that has affected the whole short form mini series as far as production goes?
Well, it's really funny that you should ask that question, because if you cast your memory back to when iPhone was first released, right, it was a very different platform than it is today. It was very closed. There was no app store. You couldn't download apps. You could barely make phone calls. You couldn't play video. You couldn't play music. It wasn't an iPod yet. And famously, Steve Jobs actually said something that he didn't believe. But when the reporter asked him, when are you going to have QuickTime? When am I going to be able to watch content on iPhone? He said nobody's ever going to want to watch content on a screen that small. So we're not really worried about bringing QuickTime to iPhone because we don't think anybody's ever going to want to watch on anything on a screen that small. He didn't believe that. He just said that to buy time, right? I mean, we really did. I mean, this was such a revolutionary product that it really did need to come out in a relatively linear fashion. Otherwise, it could have collapsed under its own weight. The complexity would have been a lot, right? So, moving this thing out, a phase at a time made perfect sense. And so I think that, everybody really wants to watch content on their iPhone. Apple makes sure that the quality of the screen on your iPhone is better than any television you'll have in your house anytime soon. And so I think the world really does love to consume content on these mobile devices, in their sort of micro spare time. Um, and so, I really do believe that there's a big market out there for short form content. YouTube has proven that time and time again. There's people that make millions and millions of dollars on TikTok and YouTube and things like that with their content. But I also believe that there's always going to be, a market for long form storytelling. That people have been telling stories since the beginning of man. Since they were writing them on caves with pictures. And so storytelling is not going away, and long form storytelling is not going away. But what I will say is that I think there's going to be a merge between the people that create the short form content and the people that create the long form content. So, again, cast your memory back only a few years ago with Quibi. Everybody remember Quibi? That was an attempt to do vertical content, that was short form, specifically targeted for this type of a device. I don't know whether Quibi failed because it was ahead of its time or because it was mismanaged. When I owned my Post House Local Hero, I delivered some projects to Quibi on behalf of some producers that I thought were pretty cool and pretty good. And about the same time, Sean Baker, the director that just won, the Oscar for Honora, shot his first full length feature film on an iPhone, Tangerine, but he shot it in landscape mode, fortunately, instead of vertically. Thankfully for us all. But I mean, it was people dabbling in that started moving us forward. And now, you've got folks like Mr. Beast that are out there that are just, making huge amounts of money, focusing on these types of devices. And I love that. I love that. I love the fact that you can create content that can be deployed in multiple different places, enjoyed in multiple different places. And each one of those things has their own intrinsic value and they don't have to be measured against each other. One of the cool things about media in general, whether it's music or whether it's movies or TV shows, as a product, is they're different from other products. I mean, if you go and you buy a car from Porsche, then you're not going to go buy a car from Mercedes or Toyota. You bought your car, right? You have a car. But just because you watch a movie from Warner Brothers doesn't preclude you from going and watching a movie on Netflix or Amazon or watching one from Warner Brothers. You can consume both, right? And so there's an infinite amount of demand for storytelling, and there's an infinite amount of demand around creative stories, and there's an infinite amount of creative people that want to tell interesting stories, and they just need tools to become democratized to give them access to taking what's in their brain and putting it on a screen. And we're really at the beginning of a revolution to allow that to happen. I've been focused on tools that have allowed professional filmmakers to be able to do that, to take ideas that are in their head and manifest them on screen. But most of those tools have either been too complex or too expensive for average folks that want to create their own content to invest in, whether it's investing financially or whether it's investing intellectually. And that's changing now. AI is a real inflection point that's really making those tools accessible, and it's abstracting the complexity. And many of those tools are free, right? And so creative people given tools like that surprise all of us every day.
That's so true, and what's interesting too is I was talking to somebody else about this the other day. You hinted on it's becoming more accessible, right? So people can get on their iPhone, they can shoot whole films on their iPhone. We do want them in landscape versus portrait. But like, yeah, it's more accessible. So, I mentioned it was a playlist era. So it's getting to the point where you got the two schools of thoughts. Hollywood creates more names and you got that name recognition, whereas influencers, there's so much playlists. The algorithms keep you from being able to discover people because you'll click on, a video for cats and all you'll see is cats. You'll never see the dogs. People in the industry, they're like, hey, we've known these people, they're influencers, or they are even music artists where they're saying, you know, we are in the industry all the time. We didn't know that this other person was big until we ran into them because we've never heard of them or anything like that. And I think that happens in Hollywood too, to an extent. But like, it's a different world. It's kind of completely morphing. And yeah, I'm glad that you touched on all of that because it's extremely true.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I felt was hugely important about the iPod revolution, right? The way iPod and iTunes revolutionized music was for exactly the same reason. Playlists, right? I mean, and you remember all the critics? They're like, "Man, MP3s are such terrible quality. Why would you ever want to listen to an MP3?" And my argument back to them was, "Dude, I can program my own radio station. I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of the quality of the music if I can program my own playlist and I can have an infinite playlist. I can have my own radio station for the rest of my life in my pocket. I don't care that it's not as high quality as vinyl. You know, I, I bought into vinyl, I bought into CD-ROM, to CDs, and then I bought into MP3s. And it's all about the convenience for me. The same thing is true for YouTube. It's that short attention span theater, everybody has, and they want to line these things up in playlists. And in some cases, they just want them to go in the background, and then they'll turn their attention to it whenever they want, right? And they'll consume these things in what I like to call bite-sized chocolate chip cookies. You really need to give people bite-sized chocolate chip cookies to consume. And when you do, you make money.
Fun size is fun size became a thing, right? We used to have the big chocolate bars, and I think we all really wanna go back to that, but fun size kind of took over the world, so I
Well,
totally
you can have
understand.
a big bag of bite-sized chocolate chip cookies,
There you go.
but you want your chocolate chip cookies to be bite-sized.
So, with all your amazing experience in post-production, you are continuing the trends, you're starting your new world, really excited for you, and you got some cool projects in the works, sounds like, and you're gonna continue on in production, which is awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about what your trajectory is and how's that going for you?
No. I'm sorry. I'd like to be able to talk in more depth, but I'm working on some things that I can't really announce yet specifically, but I can tell you sort of directionally what I'm thinking about
Yeah.
and what I see and how I'm, reacting to what I see. So, I just left Amazon MGM Studios after a nearly 4-year stint there. And it's becoming apparent to me that the studio model for making content is getting seriously squeezed. I mean, I ran a post production for local original movies, so basically all the movies outside of the U.S. For Amazon during that sort of crucial period that started with COVID and then went through the strikes and stuff like that. When domestically the industry really went into a significant recession, but internationally it didn't. During COVID and during the strikes, LA may have been quiet, but I was delivering 40 plus movies a year, to the rest of the world out there. And so I became very familiar with the studio model for creating content and the difference between the tentpole type content that's created typically in LA and New York and the US versus the local content that's created for local markets outside the US to be consumed, created and consumed by those markets. And so I start to see sort of cracks in the way that studios need to manage both of those things, and so there during COVID and during this, even still during the strikes, the mantra for most of the streamers and the studios was really aggregating eyeballs, just putting as much content out there as we could. People didn't really have anything else to do during COVID. They couldn't go anywhere. So watching, stuff on Netflix and Amazon was really the way that they stayed busy. So we had this insatiable demand for content and aggregating subscribers and aggregating eyeballs and managing churn and all the things that those guys love to do. But then almost on a dime, sometime last year, Wall Street sort of came along and said, nah, we think it's time for profitability. You need to prove to us that you can monetize the eyeballs that you've been aggregating for the last few years. So you need to show that you can be profitable before we're going to give you more, a higher stock price, more capital access and stuff like that. So the strategies changed. And at Amazon, that was a pretty significant and wrenching change. And so, edicts came from the top down that said you're just going to need to slash budgets across the board, right? And so, how are you going to be able to make? And these are projects that had, in many cases, already been greenlit, right? Hadn't started production yet, but had already been greenlit at a particular budget level. And now, all of a sudden, the realities of budget pressures start hitting every department from top to bottom, and so you look for ways to try and pull cost out. When you were already, paying pretty close attention to what the movie was going to cost. So there's not a lot of fat in it to start with. You're not, making producers rich or anything like that. So how do you go and try to pull cost out? Well, for me, based on the things that I know and the things that I love, it became obvious that technology was the way to do that, right? You can disrupt the way that you did things before with technology and have opportunities to save significant amounts of money and time. And so that was my answer, right? But in studio land, it's really hard to adopt new technologies because the ship is so big and it has so much inertia moving in a given direction. Changing that direction happens a degree at a time. It doesn't happen 10 or 20 degrees at a time. And so you can come up with technology, for instance, that says, on this part of post production, I can save you 30%. And then you present it to, leadership and they're like, Well, that's really good, but unfortunately, if we do that, there are these backs, these sort of teams in the back end in the, in the delivery part of Prime Video or whatever that are going to have to change the way that they work, and it's going to cost them so much more money that it's going to eat up any money that you could possibly save. So let's worry about that in the future and let's implement that technology some other time, right? Let's not do it on this movie. It's always let's do it on the next one, right? And so, and so basically, if you're not willing to accept new technology and you've got an edict that requires that you slash budgets from every department across the board up to 15%, what do? What's left? Well, you're already making, you've already chased the tax incentives. You're already making, movies overseas, working in local currencies and cheaper base rates and outside of the guilds and all of the, obvious ways to save money. All of those boxes have already been checked. So if you've got to reduce budgets and you're not willing to implement technology, the only thing that's left is to try to force people to work for less money. And that's not a sustainable model, right? The industry can't sustain itself that way. And people aren't willing to do that. And so they'll just say, well, no, I'll just go work on this Netflix project. I won't work on your project. And so it's very, or what happens is those people agree to work for less money, and then your product turns out to be worse. You know, you don't like the story, or the visual effects look cheesy, or the color look bad, or whatever. So the quality bar of the product suffers because at the end of the day, the laws of physics are the laws of physics, and you can't really change the laws of physics. It's that's that classic product management, triangle: bigger, faster, cheaper, pick two, you know, but they want all three. And so what do? The only thing that you can do really is kind of pick your car up off the road that you're driving on and put it on a different road where you can then pick two, and still accomplish your goals. So I really felt like the studio model is in danger of kind of collapsing. And so instead of creating a lot of content, this, I mean, if you look at Amazon, Amazon Studios creates content, Prime Video is a distributor of content, but Prime Video also distributes a lot of other people's content, right? They go and they acquire, they buy movies and acquire the rights for a certain number of years, brand it as an original, put it out there. Or there'll be a portal for, you can sign up for HBO right there on Amazon Prime, and so Amazon Studios as a studio is only one source of content that the network, Prime Video, can take. Right? The conventional wisdom that owning your own library of content is the goal, right? I mean, that everybody's content is king. We want to own the library. We want to be able to come back 10 years from now and remaster it in 120K or whatever we're doing that year. Right. And so that becomes the argument. It's like it's a make versus buy argument. Right. And so people have now been talking through that argument in their minds for almost a decade. And they're starting to realize that nobody's ever gone back into those libraries and really done anything. I mean, there are some folks that are going back into their archives and remastering some of their projects, but not many of them. And when you look at all the content that's been aggregated in all the streamers in the world, what's the rush to go back and take all that HD stuff from years and years ago and remaster it in 4K, and HDR, and how much care do you take in doing that versus just doing it automatically through some piece of software? You know, not that many people are really doing that. So it's recalibrated the whole make versus buy discussion. It skewed it more toward the buy. So in my mind, a lot more independent content is going to find its way to streamers because it's cheaper to make. It's faster to make. You can make more of them in a year, right? Um, and and it's just as high quality. The stories are just as good. And these guys now aren't afraid of technology when they make their content. They're not afraid of tapping into a global talent pool and shooting a movie in Mexico and having an editor in Spain, or shooting a movie in Colombia and having the sound mixer be in LA, right? And so technology gives us access to all of these things and all of these tools, and that model is dramatically shifting. And so I'm looking for ways to take advantage of that, to leverage technology, to leverage global networks and talent pools, to move where content is the most efficient, not necessarily the cheapest, but the best bang for your buck, and assemble stories that are highly commercial saleable, but yet really, really compelling and interesting. And so that's my vision, and that's I'm sticking to it. So we'll see.
I love that. Stick to it. I think that's a great idea, honestly, because I mean that's where everything's going. That's all the trends that keep hearing, especially as we have the influencers, or they call it the pop-up studios, right? Where they can do supposedly they can do two times more for, half the price. And I know a lot of that does depend on maybe unions are not necessarily involved and things like that. Labor laws haven't kicked in for those people yet, but also they're utilizing that technology that you were talking about. Um, so
Well,
yeah, there's a lot of different ways for it. So I think that's great that you are going to be bridging that gap and helping to, get that content out there and more accessible and stuff.
yeah. Well, and you bring up a really interesting point, right? That I think needs a little bit of attention, and that is the unions and the guilds, right? So
Yeah.
make no mistake, the unions and the guilds deliver significant value.
Oh yeah.
When you're shooting a project in the US and it's a union project, you can depend on the quality of the work that you get from any of those guild members. It's going to be that they're going to be properly trained. They're going to understand safety. They're going to understand, how professionally how to make these projects. So I strongly prefer to work within the guilds where we can, right? Where the budget of the movie allows. Now, having said that, there's an enormous class of stories that are being told at budget levels that really struggle to afford the extra money that you have to pay when you work with the guilds. And some of the projects that I'm looking at are in that bucket, right? And so, but there's a couple of different ways to skin that cat. And fortunately, after we've come out of the strikes, one of the things that I'm noticing is that the guilds are more interested in working with us and negotiating with us, and not necessarily sticking strictly to rate cards. And but they're willing to be flexible because they know that their members need work. And if it's the difference, between not working and working, not making this project and making this project, then they're smartly erring to the side of making the project. So I think the guilds are starting to evolve themselves as well at just the right time, right? Because as folks like Mr. Beast, start moving into more traditional ways to distribute content, they're going to want to make it the way they always have, right? They're going to want to make it the way they always have. And so, those kind of content creators, let me back up. The two most difficult things to do when you're making content is raise the money to make it and then find somebody to buy it, right? All that crap in the middle, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's art, but it's way easier than those two things.
Way
Yeah.
easier.
Wait, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody that's ever made a movie and raised money is laughing right now because they know, right? It's like that show on Apple TV Plus called The Studio. There's nothing more real than that to me. It makes me so nervous watching that show because I'm thinking to myself, our entire industry and my livelihood is in the hands of people just like that, right? But the people outside of that don't necessarily have the same problems. It doesn't really cost them very much to make their content. They already went out and bought the lighting they need and they use their iPhone. And they've already got, millions of followers on their social media platforms. And so they don't need to worry about selling it either. They've already built their audience. And so these guys are making great content and they're moving up into the long form, and they don't have the same constraints and same problems that the traditional studios or even independent filmmakers have. And so this is going to merge too. And independent filmmakers are going to start making content the way Mr. Beast has made content, and Mr. Beast wants to make content that gets distributed in the same places like movie theaters and streaming platforms that independent filmmakers and studios have been living in the last, 100 years. So this is happening, and the studios can ignore it at their peril, but it's happening really fast, and I want to be part of it.
I think that's fantastic, and it is happening whether you like it or not. So, I mean, you have to jump on that bandwagon or else you're sunk. Sorry about that. That's just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, so the train has left the station,
Yeah,
and you can
correct.
either be on the train, you can drive the train, or you can get run over by the train. Those are your three, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you can't change the laws of physics. Those are your only three choices. So, I want to drive the train.
Yeah, you're an innovator, and I think that's fantastic. Where can people find you to work with you and partner with you and help you out?
Well, the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn. So that's the thing that I sort of use for my professional contacts. You know, I'm not a huge social media person. I use Facebook because I keep up with my family. Um, if my kids ever found out that I have an Instagram account, they would be horrified. I don't really use it for much. I've never ever posted anything on Instagram, but I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and so that's the best place to find me for collaboration.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely reach out. Steve has got a lot of really great experience. My mind's blown just listening to him for a little bit. Steve, is there any last things you'd like to share with us before we end for the day?
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up AI, which is a really important topic, right? And I think
Yes, the
that
beast, right?
yeah, I think that AI is also another train that's left the station. But I don't fear AI the way some people on the extreme side fear AI. I subscribe to you know, my favorite quote was from Reese Witherspoon,
Oh,
who's one
yeah.
of my favorite people in Hollywood of all time. You know, she said AI is not coming for your job. The
No,
people
it's
that
not.
know how to use AI are coming for your job, right? So learn AI. And AI is this interesting thing right now because it's this disparate bucket of all kinds of different tools that are emerging. And yes, you can make, you know, a video using AI, but you have to glue like 10 things together to make it work and stuff like that. This time next year, that won't be the case. The complexity will be gone, consolidation will happen, new features will emerge. AI will be a useful tool for creating all types of content. It will never be able to out creative humans, but it will enable humans who have had creativity locked up in their brain, but had no way to get it out because they couldn't master the tools. It will give those people an opportunity to be seen and heard. And those are the stories that I'm looking for. And I want to try and find and help those folks tell their stories. So yeah, AI is coming. AI is a thing, but it's a tool, just like cloud workflows and you know all kinds of stuff. You know, so I'm still waiting for people. People used to say the computer is going to put humans out of work. There's never been a bigger job creation engine in the history of man than the microchip in the computer. And like I said, we've got computers in our refrigerators, and you know the people that delivered milk to my house aren't here anymore. But there are a lot more engineers trying to figure out how to put computers in refrigerators. So that's the way of the world.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's correct. And rabbit trail question here. Is AI gonna make it more cost effective, do you feel like, for indie production?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
without question. I mean, look, the one thing that I'm really not interested in when it comes to AI is synthetic characters. You
Yes.
know, I'm just really not interested in synthetic characters as a consumer of content.
Yeah.
Whether they look good or whether they look bad is irrelevant. I I really can't see a world where synthetic characters can capture the same performance and the same emotion and the same versatility that human characters can.
Right.
So I like to divide, you know, production and post production and storytelling and filmmaking into two halves, right? The technical half and the creative half. And my goal is to drive the technical part of that the cost of that to as close to zero as possible. So I can take that money and give it to the creative. And so any tool that we can use that's AI based that can do things like making budgeting more accurate upfront by breaking scripts down better, helping with locations, you know, helping not having to travel. So technologies like virtual production, for instance, give us the ability to do virtual sets so we don't have to move 100 people to another country to shoot this scene, you know, that kind of stuff. Those kind of technical tools are going to enable more and more and more creatives to tell more and more stories. And so, you know, you're absolutely right. There are some people that are going to use AI to just type in prompts and have that turn into video. Good luck with that. Um, who knows? Maybe they'll be great. Maybe they won't. In my mind,
There'll be a
I don't really care about it consuming that kind.
exactly. I think there'll be a market for it, like with anything, but I think people really want that genuine connection. It's kinda like an automated voice on your phone when you call into a company. People always wanna talk to somebody. They wanna see that real human being. So I feel like that's still gonna people are
Yeah,
still
I
gonna
mean,
be in.
I agree. I mean, you know, it's one of those kind of things where so many people think of AI outthinking humans in terms of outsmarting them, right? You know, and I'm like, well, okay, that's not a very high bar. You know, most Americans can't do basic math and struggle to speak English properly. So outthinking humans isn't that hard. Out creating humans is a lot harder, right? That's a lot harder for AI to capture. And again, I think once people start seeing the results of those attempts, they're probably gonna look back at that and go, it's not nearly as interesting to me. I don't like that. I don't want I'm not willing to pay. So, we'll see. I could be completely wrong, but most of the time I'm
Agree. Thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it again.
no, the pleasure's all mine. Yeah, we've been talking about doing something like this for a while, so I'm glad we finally
Yeah, me too. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll catch you guys next time. Take care and see you soon.